everybody to Effective Communication Strategies for Program Management. I'm with Oracle. I'm specifically in the industry strategy group within Oracle, and I deal primarily in public sector. So this is kind of my native ground. I deal with not only federal but also state, local levels, not only U.S. but globally as well. So I hope you get excited about what we're kind of do today. I've tried to put together a program for you that's very practical in nature. A lot of the information that we're going to go over today is battle-worn and tested type of information. There's a lot of tips in here for you. There's a lot of checklists in here for you. A lot of what I'm going to go over is actually based on PMI best practices as well, in addition to a couple of pieces that actually come from the Harvard Business Review in terms of how to communicate effectively. Okay, so hopefully we'll get you some tidbits that you can actually walk away with. Here's our agenda for what we're going to be doing. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here just talking about communication planning, not spending a lot of time in terms of putting together a communication plan, because I think most of you have probably done that. But I, once again, like to have an interactive session for you. So this is a lot of you learning together as well to see what your different agencies and bureaus are doing. And I'm, of course, here to help you intercede as well. I've been doing communications for about 20 years. And I've actually worked in a PMO office down at GSA in Washington, D.C., so I've seen things blow up and I've seen them work smoothly as well. So I kind of bring that experience to the table. There's other things we're going to go through here that you really need to consider as you're kind of going through your communication planning. Second thing is vehicles, and what exactly do those mean, and what vehicles are you using. One of the key things that the advisory board had actually wanted me to cover here dealt with executive sponsors and stakeholders, and actually how best to handle those, how to handle project opponents, because there's always that situation that everybody confronts. That's going to lead into communication strategies and styles. So you'll see that everyone kind of falls into a style group. What are some of the better communication strategies to handle, and ways to handle people from that perspective. And then lastly, we're just going to kind of close out in terms of trying to put all this stuff together. We're gonna end. That's about 30 or 40 minutes just of general comments from me. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to wave the state flag. Okay. We're going to do a communication workshop, and that's going to comprise a couple of exercises. I got to ask everybody first. I sent out a couple of emails just reminding everybody who's going to come. I gave you a lot of homework assignments, so welcome to communications, right? And your PR session. How many of you actually had an opportunity to fill out your homework assignments and actually do those ahead of time? Okay. Okay, so not too bad. So we're gonna do two communication exercises. One is a specific case study. What we're going to do is break into groups of, we've got about 50 people, so we're going to break into 5 groups of 10. Okay, so we'll cover that at the end of this. And the second is actually a communication assessment, and that is an organizational assessment, and that's the one pager that's out there, and that's what these charts are along the wall. Okay, that I'll have your group fill out. So you'll see some trending here. So I'll give you an idea of how you're doing, your agency, bureau is doing versus what everybody else is doing, okay? And lastly, if we have some time, we're gonna go and take a look at a GSA case study. Okay, this is on YouTube. We're not gonna look at the whole thing. It goes for around 30 minutes. But we'll go through some snippets, and the reason I brought that up was because it in fact has a lot of the key elements that I'm talking about and what GSA did to implement a very large SaaS project, okay? So just a couple of learning objectives here in terms of, getting a better sensitivity to, communicating your messages and looking at in terms of who's actually receiving them. And a lot of it has to do with, I'll call it kind of an out-of-body experience. So you need to understand who your stakeholders are. The other thing is just in terms of communication planning, preparation, delivery, and feedback, is really understanding some of the key attributes on that, and really being methodical in terms of your planning. That's what really leads to strategic success in terms of executing the communication plan for projects. And lastly, and these are some of the political lessons I'll throw in at the end, is once again trying to get something out of communicating with diverse stakeholder groups, and how to effectively do that, and how to kind of work your way through that labyrinth, which a lot of times is not a very pleasant experience, especially if you have a lot of stakeholders that aren't supporting you. Okay? So, we'll start off with an interesting study here. Actually, PMI did a study, their 2013 Pulse of the Profession study, which basically was studying project management. And what was interesting about this is the Pulse study revealed that one of the most critical factors in project management is actually effective communication to all stakeholders. Now, what's interesting about this chart is it reveals that of $135 million is at risk for every $1 billion of project spend, which is quite a bit. But if you think that further research on the importance of effective communication uncovers a startling fact that 56%, or about 75 million of that 135 million, is at risk due to ineffective communications for every $1 billion in spend. So, at the end of the day, communications is really important, and you need to do it effectively. There's a couple of other studies that are important. For example, Forbes Insight 2010 strategic study, adapting corporate strategy to changing economy, found that 9 out of 10 CEOs believe that communication is critical to the success of their strategic initiatives. And nearly half of those respondents cited communication as an integral and active component of the strategic planning. Okay? Now, the PMI Pulse research study further went on to say that 55% of project managers agree that effective communications to all stakeholders is critical for their success. So this is backed up once again by PwC, which did their third global CIO study and found that the current state of project management reveals that effective communications is associated with a 17% increase in finished projects within budget. Okay? So these are some good data points for you in terms of the importance of communications within the project management lifecycle. So, as we all know, not all projects succeed, and on average, 2 in 5 projects don't meet their original goals and business intent. And half of those unsuccessful projects are related to ineffective communications. And it's always funny, too, because if you look at the speakers for everybody kind of starts off with these metrics, right? So what's the relevance? But you're always starting off with project failure. It's a little depressing, but if you know what the cause is, you can certainly create a remedy to that. So results from these surveys reveal that aspects of project communications are challenging, but the 2 big problems area are a gap in understanding business benefits, and also in challenges surrounding the language that's used to share project-related information. So fundamentally, that gets down to people not articulating clearly what they're trying to get across. It seems pretty intuitive, but that's what it is. So the difficulty is certainly exacerbated behind the project manager, which a lot of times is supposed to be the communication director, and generally the lack of understanding of who their audiences are. So the question is how can you kind of rectify that? So let me ask you, in your first question for the audience, in terms of your particular organizations, how much has communication been a critical problem area within your project management activities? A lot? How about everybody else? Anybody else? Big deal? Now, have you seen a couple of areas between those 2 problem areas that I mentioned, between business benefits and language? Have you seen actually either of those 2 areas percolate to the top in terms of trying to figure out what went wrong, what went right? A little bit? Okay, let's jump over to communication planning here. So, one of the first aspects when you're doing your planning, obviously, is you need to figure out what you want to do, okay? So you got to ask yourself, what's your communication objective? Are you trying to raise awareness? You're trying to change a preference. You know, I'm on the commercial side a lot, so we're trying to change a buying preference, for example. Are you in a crisis? Is it crisis communication? So I think that's probably one of the first things you need to ask yourself. So in terms of general planning, you need to look at a project communication strategy, okay? And you need to ask yourself, you've got to define that strategy, and it's done to ensure that you've got stakeholders that are engaged. And the other thing you want to do is you want to muster support for your program. That's the two primary reasons to do that. So just a quick review, the reason you do a communication strategy is you do it to identify the communication strategies for your specific audiences that you're looking at. You want to identify the communication mechanisms and the tools to be used, and define the key prospect messages, outbound messages that are going out. And you also want to detail the responsibilities, how the feedback will be provided by the stakeholders and dealt with by the project. So you've got your communication strategy. That idea is also used to define the approach for monitoring and evaluating where you want to go. By contrast to that, you should also have a project communication action plan, okay? So usually include that in the appendix, and we'll ask everybody here, do you actually do some of these things? Usually a standalone document, but it's used to document specific communication activities and programs that you're undertaking. So generally details, for example, alignment of specific stakeholders and stakeholder groups and your key messages that are out there. And the communication tools that you're going to use, so the time frames, the feedback mechanisms, and the associated cost with all this stuff. So regardless of the size and complexity of the project that you're doing, the action plan really should be maintained as a separate document, okay? So the question I've got for you, and I've fallen into this trap very early in my career where you actually, you create an action document or an activity document in terms of program activity or in terms of communication activity, but you actually never create a strategy document. So I think that's generally the way that a lot of people do that. So how many of all of you have actually, and raise your hand, have actually spent the time thinking about creating a strategy document that then supports your activity? So just a couple, right? So what happens, a lot of times then is you end up just doing as opposed to understanding why you're doing. Hence the reason for the strategy document, okay? So once you've defined your stakeholders, and we're going to go over this a little bit in terms of a stakeholder communication plan. Once you've defined and articulated who your stakeholders, then you can, I think, really develop your communication plan. So you do that by identifying who the stakeholders are, what details need to be communicated to each of those groups, how often and the frequency that you need to communicate, where the stakeholders and how the stakeholders are going to be communicated to, okay? So communicating the status of active projects relies on the same type of audience awareness. So if you're looking at your audience, you have to ask yourself, how are they consuming their media, okay? Everybody's different, everybody consumes it differently. And I'll give you the instance here, just in terms of news consumption. How do you get your news? Do you read the Sacramento Bee every day? Do you go on the web every day? Do you get it on your iPad every day? You see what I mean? So you need to take all of that into consideration in terms of your communication efforts and how you're reaching out. So develop your plan by asking the right questions. So who the stakeholders are, project sponsors, team members, customers, community members often show up on stakeholder list. And a lot of times you'll have the press as well as key stakeholders. In terms of the details communicated to each group, that depends on their level of involvement. So who needs to know what, right? So when must a project team communicate with each group of stakeholders? Some require daily attention, some weekly attention, some monthly, okay? And that you need to determine as well. So we talked about when stakeholders are supposed to receive their communication. Is it a single channel or is it multiple channels? And think about that interaction as well. Okay, as opposed to, once again, just doing. And then probably one thing I think that some people don't spend a lot of, or I should say spend enough time thinking about is how project team members communicate with stakeholders. Because you're on the ground, you're communicating with various project and team members. The question is who's doing it and to what degree are they doing it, okay? So I guess one question I have for all of you is, usually you've got a project manager, so does that project manager as a normal rule end up being the de facto communication director for the project? Or do you actually spend time saying, this team is going to handle the communication activities? So for everybody who's the project manager and communication director, so you end up all as one, right? Okay, so when you do that, so let me ask another question of everybody. In terms of your communication expertise, how comfortable do you feel actually putting together a strategy and a plan and then executing on it? Does everybody feel good about that? Or I could use a little bit of help? Okay, so then the next question is do you seek counsel? So, you know, most agencies obviously have an outbound business liaison office. You know, you get communication professionals that are used to doing this all day, right? So do you seek that advice from time to time? Or do you just kind of, once again, go off and do it? So let's spend a second here just talking about tools. There's a lot of communication channels out there, and there's been a lot of change. So in the last 5 years. So the question is what do you do to get your messages across, right? So, you know, for large, complex projects, you just have communications. A lot of times you may, in fact, actually need to have a marketing component associated with that. So ask yourself which tools would be the most appropriate to get your message across, okay? And they need to be formatted, by the way, accordingly, okay? Most people don't do that. You think it's kind of a blanket way of doing all channels of communication. It doesn't work that way. So determine which tool best suits your target audience. And you really need to think about that. And you need to think about the demographics of your audience as well, right? Because if you're doing an external program that involves external stakeholders as opposed to just internal people, interdepartmentally, you may be doing a child abuse program, whatever the case may be, and your demographics, once again, 18 to 25, 18, 30-year-olds are going to look at this stuff differently than people that have been in the trenches for a while, work as an interdepartmental type of effort that you're doing. It's kind of interesting. Gartner identified some simple mechanisms for project communications. You know, and I have to kind of laugh this because they're and the one thing they thought that was absolutely essential for project manager or management is face-to-face communications. So some of these seem pretty obvious. I think the one thing you want to ask yourself too, are you a little bit more of an introvert versus an extrovert in terms of your communication efforts? So half of all of this is identifying what your style is as well, okay?
You know, that's not so obvious, really. I've worked in more than one organization that people sitting right next to me, they communicate by email. That is not that obvious anymore.
I know, it's funny. I've had conversations with people by email sitting right next to me, and you could just turn your chair around and talk. And I like to just talk, all right? The thing is, email is an impersonal type of communication, and it is subject to a lot of miscues. And once again, depending on what your writing style is, you know, I tend to be very, not so much abrupt's the wrong word, but you tend to be very quick-fingered on email. So you just kind of get it out without doing a lot of copy, right? So, but the thing is, that's the reason you've got expressions, right? Happy face and all this stuff, so people know that you're actually joking because they can't physically see you. They don't get mad at you, all right? So these are all kind of important things because there's an impartial perspective towards a lot of these things. Some of these communication channels are static, some are active. So ask yourself what's active and what's static. So some of these people are going to come to, and they're going to, they're going to be basically for informational purposes only. There's going to be other sites, for example, and this actually dovetails to our next slide here. If we just look at communications engagement, you know, if you look at websites, you can really break down all of your communications into these 4 areas. So whether it's verbal, electronic, written, or visual, what's going to work well for you? And you need to know the limitations on all of these communications as well. So the one thing I think to keep in mind is, you know, a visualization is actually stronger than a written word. So, you know, and I have to use the example of Ronald Reagan, so speaking of somebody from California, because Michael Beavers was his PR man, and he understood this beautifully. You know, this is the reason you saw a lot of mom and apple pie in Ronald Reagan's political campaigns, because he knew at the end of the day the American people would understand and rationalize those images versus what he may have said during the day. So it's an important component to keep in mind in terms of your communication planning. Okay, so it's the visual is as important as what you're saying, you know. Now, just in terms of communication engagement, the other thing to keep in mind is the message source. So ask yourself, where's the message coming from? So is it coming from the project sponsor? Is it coming from the project manager? What conduit is it coming from? I think the one thing, you know, you absolutely have to stress with all of these, a lot of projects will fail because they do not have executive sponsorship, right? So you need to make sure that there's a consistent top-down message approach for senior management to the rest of the agency on an ongoing basis as well. So people need to sense that support in terms of where you're going. The other thing too here for projects, for example, with broader communities, local governments, business industry, or even business leaders, you can also use these people to help you get your message out. I remember years ago when I was at the Department of Commerce during the Reagan administration, we actually had an industry sector group dedicated specifically just to propagating the message in terms of what we were trying to do, okay? And all of these folks were in fact just ambassadors. So we took the PR approach that we want to put you on the road and we want you to talk about this program, and we want, and of course they supported what we were doing because we're trying to support small and medium-sized export businesses. This is what this whole program was about. So you've got people in authority actually speaking to where you need to go and what you need to do, and and then you've got the administrative support doing that. So if you haven't done that, I would suggest that you do that. So you can create the PR plan for them, create all the materials for them, brief them on a regular basis, and help them with their engagement schedule. Okay, so that can really help you push forward a communication program. So, and lastly, it generally gets down to responsibilities in terms of communication engagement as well. So who's really responsible for your communication effort? Is it the project manager? Is it the program manager? Is it that person or a couple people in conjunction with the communication director? Is it those two in conjunction with an agency head? You really need to designate that person or key committee in order to make sure that the effort moves along accordingly. So with all of that said, we've talked about some communication channels. I'm really curious as to what everyone out there is actually using right now. So maybe you all could share with me some of the tools you're using. So for example, who's actually using the web for more than informational purposes in your agency? Anybody can share anything?
One of our, a project that we're just starting, we have a web page. As to the progress, it's pretty high level, but as it gets more detailed, we're going to be adding in. We're working a lot with retailers, grocery stores, so there's a different section for each of the different, say, audiences of what they might be interested in the project.
So you've actually got a feedback mechanism for them to...
It's not so much a feedback, it's probably more the push. This is where we are on the schedule. This is upcoming events, that kind of thing.
Okay, so you push it out over the web? So you send out an email?
Yeah, it's a web page.
Okay, so you send out an email linked to a...
Yeah, I think they know that it's there. So I'm not really involved in that piece, but I know that that's there. I haven't gotten involved in it yet. So.
Okay. What about mobile devices? Okay, everybody's got an iPhone. You're not doing anything on that end?
Correction, we don't have iPhone.
We don't get iPhones.
They're just regular telephones, right? Yep.
We are. We're actually in October implementing a mobile application for child support services so that they can make their payments on their mobile app.
Oh, nifty. Okay. So what about, I assume everybody uses the traditional techniques. So we all get meeting to death, right? We all have the conference calls, all right? So I'm trying to think of things that are out of the box. And, it's funny because agencies, don't necessarily get funded well in order to be able to do this. On the federal side, it's interesting. All federal agencies were mandated to actually come up with a social media strategy because you have people calling in. So you have services, HHS, for example, people calling in about Social Security payments. They were really behind the 8 ball and all of this stuff. So they went through a lot of issues because the driving force on the federal side was people were just coming to work with iPhones. So you had a security issue. But you also had constituents calling in saying, can't we respond via our iPhone for what we need to do versus a website? Okay, so you've got some driving things there as well. So is there anybody actually looking at this? We've got a couple examples here in terms of some, we'll call them cutting edge types of social media thing. So does anybody else actually have a CIO who's actually cognizant of all of this stuff?
Well, I work at the state teachers retirement system and are not related to IT, but we've put up specific websites for messaging about a specific issue. We're about to deploy a mobile application. We send tweets out. We have a Facebook page, but that's not, our structure is a little bit different than through a traditional CIO.
Well, tweeting is, most people kind of go, my kids do that, right? Sort of thing. But it's gone mainstream. So you need to think about that, and you need to think about it. If you look at some of these things, so you look at Facebook, MySpace, YouTube, you look at Twitter that you just mentioned, RSS feeds. I use those specifically for news media. All right. So if you've got a program, and this is just, it's kind of like in politics, it's opposition research. So you can set up your RSS feeds. And if you're doing an external program and you're looking for press, because stuff gets picked up on different wires, all those feeds will bring that right back to you. Okay, so that'll give you some immediate intelligence of what the perception is for perhaps your particular program that's out there. Okay. Okay, so let's jump over to talking about executive sponsorship here. So we kind of talked about some of the first challenges to determine who you're going to communicate with and what your messages are. You've also got to give, obviously, thought to a thorough stakeholder engagement analysis, which should identify and classify your project stakeholders and analyze their influence on the project, define how to kind of manage their influence, positively or negatively, with the end goal being to win their support. So once you've identified your stakeholders, then you can kind of really start to build out on your communication plan, look at your communication mechanisms and tools that we discussed, and figure out who's going to kind of be responsible for kind of executing on all this stuff. Okay? So we've basically got in terms of your stakeholder engagement process, three documents really that you need to prepare in detail and give some thought to. One, your stakeholder engagement plan, which I just mentioned. the project communication strategy and action plan that I mentioned. And the third piece is really a marketing plan, and people may not have expertise in this. So I would suggest that you seek expertise out to do that. The idea behind a marketing plan is go to market. So if you're going to go to market, you need to figure out what your project outputs are going to be. Okay. So if they're going to be particular communication vehicles, you need to figure out how to get those out and get those into the best channel. So your communication person will have an idea on that. A really good marketing person will have an even better idea in terms of doing that. The other little thing that I'll mention has to do with just change management strategies, because all of these overlap with your project communication strategies. And you need to identify the change agents. So there's always people who are going to be part of your stakeholder committee, we'll call them, who are going to be change agents. They just like to see positive change. And there are people who like to see negative change too. Okay, right? Oh, nasty. So you need to identify who's willing to accept support or support you. And keep that in mind in terms of your stakeholder analysis, all right? So regardless of whether the project is, public-facing or government-facing, in times of crisis, once again, you've got to look at all your stakeholders and look at senior management to say, hey, if we're having a problem with this, how are we going to mitigate this particular group who is working against us in the tide, okay? The other thing I'll just say, just in terms of key messages here, is to reinforce your key messages that your agency has as a whole. A lot of times we tend to operate in silos, but if you're going out through a communication channel, you may in fact have that right. Take a holistic perspective. So you may actually not be at a level to actually do that, but elevate yourself and actually try and think that way, okay? Because that actually gets you more buy-in from more people at more levels, okay? In terms of stakeholder expectations, for projects to deliver reasonable results, you've got to start with reasonable expectations, right? So your stakeholders need to be engaged early, and that's going to give you some insight in terms of their expectations and their assumptions, and that's how you can start to build your plan. It's always when things are done after the fact, I think, where you run into problems, okay? So stakeholder expectation management really includes getting everyone to agree that the project scope is agreed on, and there's clear agreement from all the business owners that all the project outputs are agreed upon as well, okay? So you need to, once again, it's regular communications and it's proactive communications in order to make this work really well. So a lot of, project managers, fall under the edith of kind of under promise and over deliver, which is usually a good way to do it. You get usually, I don't know too many uncomplicated state or even federal projects from a communication perspective. It's not a bad thing to do. It's always a matter of pulling back, because at the end of the day, it's a matter of setting expectations, but you're always, I think, from a communications perspective, people are delighted that in fact you may have exceeded those. So you're a hero, and everybody in that communication food chain is a hero as well. So the other thing, just in terms of communication commitment, a few things for you, because we get into ongoing project managers. So what can you do to maintain consistent, continual stakeholder commitment? So a couple of suggestions here for you. So maintaining the project profile by broadly promoting the project, what the project's doing, and how you're delivering it at every opportunity, okay? Promote the progress made on the project, and not just the activity as well, okay? So get a little out of the task-oriented mode and talk about progress. The other thing here too is reinforce and marry the project benefits to specific stakeholders. Okay, I can't say that enough. In advertising, there's an old axiom, and this research still holds true. You know how many times you need to see something actually before you'll act on it? How many times do you think that is?
Eight.
Somebody's? Any guesses?
Said 8.
8, more or less? It's what, 7, but it's pretty close. So the whole point is it's repetition, and I think there's a few cardinal rules in communication. So one is repetition, but the second is consistency over time, okay? And that's what will give you great impact. In terms of challenging the views of opponents, provide information that invalidates their perspective, all right? And address any threats that they may feel from their perspective, okay? Once again, think about change management, because as you're doing this is going to affect what they do. So operationally, how much is this program going to affect them? And that's going to help you articulate your communications. The other thing you need to do is seed the field. And what I mean by that is you've got all of these constituents out here, and you've got a core group of people that you're working with, but there's going to be obviously other influencers out there that are going to get involved over time. So you need their cooperation. So let them, even though they're not currently involved in the project, let them know and seek their advice out or counsel before they actually get involved. So you have an ally, right, as you're progressing. This goes without saying, but establish good communications with your key stakeholders. That goes without saying. The thing is too, and that comes from multiple levels. So the project manager is certainly one person, but you need to do that on multiple levels. And one other thing too, that people tend to do, I see this a little bit more in the corporate arena than I actually do on the public sector side, but it's just the general use of external consultants to kind of validate your methodology or what you're doing, because people tend to believe, consultants, right, more than they do people that are in the trenches. So I see that all the time in the private sector, and I hadn't really thought about it until I actually prepared this presentation. I said, okay, So you tend to fall into that. But if they're doing that, that's probably, if your management team is doing that, that's probably why they're doing that. Okay. Now, the stakeholder power grid. Okay. So everybody, after you've completed the stakeholder classification and you've kind of done a little bit of analysis, take a look at your stakeholder power grid. Put people in those areas. So that gives you kind of a checkpoint of where you kind of go. You want to do this analysis before you do your project communication strategy and before you do your project action plan. Okay? Because this will give you some directional latitude of where you need to go. Okay, let's jump over to assessing your communication plan. So successful communication plans certainly identify your stakeholders, the information you're communicating, and how that information is being communicated. Now, I'm being really prescriptive on all of this stuff because you need to be aware of it. There's a lot of moving pieces here. You need to be aware of them and the influence of each of them, okay? So, a couple, in your communication plan, you should at least have a few, a couple of these key elements anyway. Background, obviously the communication plan, your stakeholder analysis, your clearly articulated objectives, the strategy for going about how you're going to be doing your communication, potential issues and risk, as well as any associated budget figures with this as well, because all of these things have different costs, and that's always an issue. So when you're assessing your communication plan, a couple of key points here. Build your communication and look at your communication plan as a strategy and not simply as an action plan. I think that's probably the most profound thing I can mention to you here. So develop a big picture communication strategy goal. So think of your vision or your mission statement. it may be departmentally, but also in terms of how it ties into what the state needs to do, for example. Clearly define your objectives. So objectives change over time. So articulate those. Don't take those for granted. Identify the critical tactics too you're gonna do. So more specifically, what do you need to do to get where? Okay. So that'll give you some good metrics to see how well you're doing. And then secondly, incorporate a feedback loop. So how are you going to measure your success? Boy, I sound like PMI here. PMI commercial, don't I? So, okay. The second major area, just in terms of your communication assessment, is understanding your communication channels. So recognize the limitation of various channels, right? Some last for a while, others evaporate very quickly, okay? So, and I'll use the example of a tweet is gone, right? Here today, it's only 40 characters. Print, you know, they call it readership, and there's pass along. So that's going to be around for a while. So you really need to think about all of that stuff. So match the channel once again to the desired level of interaction and your feedback needs. Okay, in terms of what you're trying to achieve. Look at multiple channels. I always like to use as many channels as I possibly can. Okay, in order to get something across, because once again, if you take the metric of it takes someone 7 times to see something and you get bombarded by umpteen messages per day, what do I need to do to get that across? Okay, so really think about that. The other last point here is just looking at packaging techniques. Okay. So one cue here is using language of the end user that will aid in your pull-through, okay? So yeah, I'll use the simplistic example here. If it's for a kid, speak like a kid, because the kid will get it, right? So, you know, it's kind of like, you know, the news media in the Washington Post, for example. You get your regular newspaper, you get a kids section, right? The kids section is actually interesting, you know? I mean, it's you know, it's dumbed down, obviously, but you won't find any 6-syllable words. You know, so it's that sort of idea, okay? Think about your communications in terms of constructing them well. So don't be ad hoc, don't shoot from the hip in terms of what you need to do. And the other thing is, and I have fallen into this trap because I've heard myself saying this on many occasions, but don't fall for the lowest common denominator. So you have to make an assumption that there's a knowledge base out there, so you kind of start from there. Okay, that isn't necessarily going to push your agenda forward in terms of your communication, your project activity, right? So give them some homework and then bring them in at a mid-tier level and drag them along. Okay, so just on communication styles, and I'm just going to tell you what. You're getting tired of hearing me talk, so I'm going to breeze through some of these things here. So some suggestions for you in terms of more, 8 ways to effectively communicate your strategy a little bit more. So once again, keep the message simple. What matters most is that you establish relevance for everyone within your organization in terms of what you need to do. So it's not only about what you're doing, but how it's going to affect them as well. So when you do that, keep the message simple, but deep in meaning as well. So it's got to have some relevance for you. And the more relevance it's going to have, the more successful you're going to be, okay? So the second point here is build behavior based on market and customer insights. The one thing most organizations do is they do outside surveying, okay? And they do everything's outbound for communication programs. But there's very few people that actually build internal campaigns based on market and customer insights that bring your strategy kind of to life for employees in the agency, right? I see that all the time because everything is outbound, outward focused. So what are you doing internally to actually educate people? Because those are your proponents, those are your ambassadors, right, that are out there, all right? Point 3 here is use a disciplined framework. So, I'll give you 3 tenets on this. Create some messaging that's inspiring. That's particularly important when you're sharing significant accomplishments or introducing a new initiative. Try to educate people as well, okay, in terms of what you're trying to do. educate your teams on the validity of your strategy and the role of your execution, what you're trying to do. Reinforce what you're doing as well. So you need to repeat messages. And if I sound like I'm being repetitive, because there are a few cardinal rules, once again, in communications at work, okay? But repeat your message. Once again, look at your audience and have it come down once again from an authority on a recurring basis, okay? Point 4 here is thinking broader than a typical CIO, right? So, and this is an interesting concept here too. So, a lot of times, once again, it's top-down communication. But employees are a lot of times more likely to believe what the agency heads are saying if you hear similar arguments from your peers, right? So the one thing you should do is try and designate or develop a team of employees actually to serve as ambassadors to deliver your program message, okay? I bet you don't do that, do you? Okay? So that's actually pretty good. Once again, think of it in terms of roving diplomats, roving ambassadors. Point 5 here is put on the real person hat. Nobody likes corporate speak. Nobody likes government speak. It's even worse. Oh my God, right? So you want authentic, real messages that people can relate to. So if it sounds phony to you, don't do it. Don't do it. And probably more than anything else too is tell a story. Okay, because people like to hear stories, right? Everything, really good storytelling. PBS, great storytelling. It's compelling. It draws you in, right? Point 7 here is 21st century media. So we kind of try to bring that out for you. So if you're behind the curve, which I know you are in some instances, think about it, bring it forward, because it really isn't going to go away, okay? And social media is really where it's at. So I think you'll see a radical transformation. Once again, you'll be a hero. You just need to spend some time understanding the medium, okay? And then lastly is just making the investment. And that really gets down to what I was saying earlier about funding internal communication campaigns. So whether it's amongst employees within an agency or interdepartmental effort is to actually make the effort to kind of do that, okay? Okay, so now that we've done all that, what else do you need to do? So you've identified the stakeholders, you've kind of looked at the benefit steps and the measures, you've kind of addressed negative perceptions and kind of noted those interactions. Your goal here is to build support across various groups. And more importantly, what you've got to do is share the credit for the success, or not so much the failure, right? Because we're not going to go there. But is to kind of share that. So that's what I mean by kind of assigning anxiety, because it's one. If you want to really look at it as one large family to make this project a success, that's kind of what you need to do. There's a lot of reasons for program failure, ineffective stakeholder communications. I've been in many meetings like this. All right, so you get some key things here. You didn't anticipate the need. You were shooting from the hip. You didn't scan a report. So you always have to keep your ears open. Talk to a lot of people. Be timely in terms of your responsiveness. I know that I really appreciate that, because even if you're too busy, just say, I'm too busy, and I'll get back to you. But for a key stakeholder, if you just go dark, man, you lose instant credibility, believe me. So the other thing too is no project's imperfect, or I should say perfect. So you're going to have limitations. Acknowledge those, and let people know what you're trying to do to fix those. Okay, so that gives you instant credibility. And the other thing too is when you do something good, share it amongst all the stakeholders. So give everyone a reason to celebrate. Okay, because I don't think there's enough of that actually. So I'm going to buzz through this. Tips for dealing with project opponents. So here's that checklist I was telling you about. So, and I'll just go through a couple of these. You can make some notes, and once again, all of these presentations can be available online for you, so you can use them as reference points moving forward. when you're dealing with project opponents, I guess kind of the obvious thing is, do they have a valid opinion or view of this stuff, right? Or do you think, you guys are just a blithering idiot, right? So that's the important thing, because what you want to do is diffuse that. Look at the influence of that particular project opponent and see what you can do. I'd suggest sitting down with a team and actually doing kind of, once again, be a little politically savvy here in terms of what-if scenarios. Preface the message of what you're saying within the context of wider organizational benefits, okay, in terms of where your department's going, so people feel that there's like, oh, we're doing this for what reason? Okay, so think about that. Take an educational approach. I had mentioned implementing changes to business processes, so it's important to understand and identify who's actually going to be affected by that. And who can change it, and who's going to understand it and not understand it. So if I had to give you a supreme example of not understanding kind of change management, in communications, it was the first healthcare initiative that Hillary Clinton did to try and get the first healthcare reform done. And part of that was she did not include all stakeholders in that initial communication and analysis. So and it was a complete disaster. Okay. So plan all issues raised by project components are going to be addressed. Okay. Involve project sponsors and project companions in planning to respond to any resistance you might change. Okay. And the other thing here too, which may not seem too comfortably, but deliver the bad news face to face to your detractors. That actually is disarming, amazingly. I guess, and I'll close on this little section by just saying, for some individuals, you probably don't, and who may be important, you don't need to formalize a planned approach. There are some stakeholders you're not going to be able to please, so you're not going to be able to win. So you need to mitigate. All right, that's always going to be the case. So the question is what are you going to do to mitigate? Okay. So I'm going to quickly, since I am actually talking too much, I'm going to quickly go through these, so I won't go in great detail. These are lessons from Capitol Hill, okay, that tie in not only communications, but survivor skills for the project manager, okay? So, a lot of this touches on what makes a politician great, okay, in terms of where they're going and what they need to do. So, keep in mind, when you're mapping the political landscape and keeping your map close at hand, a good politician always understands who's with them, who's against them, and who's sitting on the sidelines. So they do it consistently by placing themselves and your peers, talking to their constituents, okay, and other stakeholders. So you can do it, and they do it, by the way, in a systematic way through polling and research, okay? So program managers can do the same. You can absolutely do the same thing. So be flexible. It's the second major point here. Now that you're getting good at listening, you may get guilty of sticking to a plan and forging ahead, stop, or rethink this, whatever the case may be. And you may need to make some correctional decisions. So, a lot of politicians are accused of taking flip-flopping back and forth, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because they're growing, as a project manager. So nobody likes to do that because you feel like you're kind of backtracking. So go out and get the vote and thank your campaign. So once again, this is a matter of think politically, think about actually putting together a campaign. At the end of the day, what you do want to do is you want to thank your supporters or your campaign team to help you actually get there. Okay. Bipartisanship aside, you do want to reach across the aisle and get things done. Okay, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. Point 5 here is honing your key message and stumping it relentlessly. So this is the whole idea of repetition, right? The whole point is that a good politician, like a good communication director, constantly works on his message and refines it every single time and continues to stump it over and over and over again until people get it. So that's what you need to do with your communication efforts. Point 6 here, creating a cabinet. You need a fan club, all right? So create your cabinet. You need your cohorts to help you out, okay? And it's not just simply people within your department, it's all up and down, so everybody is really on the same team. And then lastly, at the end of the day, be passionate about what you, this enthusiasm will come across in your communications and everything that you want to do. Okay? Okay, so putting your plan into action here, just some closing thoughts here. And this goes back to the PMI study that we brought. So I brought up at the beginning of the meeting here. So closing communication gaps around your business benefits, tailor the communications to different stakeholder groups. Okay. Acknowledge the value of project management. Now, that may be a little hard to do, all right, because the question is what's the value of project management within the organization? So your job then is to, if you've got an executive sponsor or a couple of people who think it might be important, you need to convince them it's very important, okay? So I always find in situations like this is just back everything up with facts, because this is an established discipline that can really help you. And if your communication plans are lacking, you've now got a lot of ammunition to go to say our project is potentially going to fail because we don't have this. So you can head off the disaster before it happens. Okay, and then lastly, once again, use standardized project management communication practices. There's a lot of things that work and don't work out there. There's a few cardinal rules. Happy to share any more of that with you. Just make sure it's highly articulated and organized, and I think you'll be in good shape. Okay. And then last, oh, by the way, which is the whole point of this slide. Speaking in the language of the C-suite, all right? The whole point is you do need to talk up too, all right? So your executive sponsors are the reason you're there, right? So you need to be able to speak the language of the C-suite, okay? So be less tactical, more strategic in terms of your approach. Okay, hallelujah, he's done. All right, communication exercises for you. Now these are supposed to be fun, folks, so once again, to help you learn, Daryl and myself here, we're both from Oracle, will help facilitate and explain anything to you as we kind of go along. We got a couple of things here. We'll give everybody a little bit of time to do the communication. This is a case study. The state of California, this is a real life case study. There are 5 scenarios here, okay, in this document. And what I'd like all of you to do is to break out into 5 groups of 10, okay? Designate a lead and designate a recorder, okay? And as you've gone through this, for anybody who hasn't read this, go ahead and read it. My apologies for the length, but need to give you the context of what's actually going on in the agency. So there are questions here, scenario 1, and then the communication exercise. So what I'd like you to do as a group is to give some thought as to how to answer that. No right, no wrong answers. This is a learning exercise to see who's doing what everybody's approach is, okay, to that. So we'll give you, I guess, about 20 minutes to do that, all right? And then we'll come back and we'll go back and do a little bit of reporting on that. The other thing that we will do is a communication plan assessment, okay? Now this is really an agency kind of department communication assessment. It's meant to gauge, gee, how well do you think you're doing in your particular agency? So it's going to be interesting. All those charts along the wall, you'll see there's a rating system of 1 to 5 here. So 1 is, if you look at the question and answer the question, it's true in a few cases. 3 would be it's true in some cases. And a 5 would be it's true in almost all cases. Okay? So you'll see on the groups here, that everybody's groups, stay in the same groups. If you answer question 1 and say it's only applicable in a few cases, then just put a hash mark next to that 1. Okay? And just go all the way down with all of those questions. And so within each group, we're going to see some trends in terms of who's actually doing what, which I think will be pretty revealing in terms of your communication assessment within your particular groups. Okay? The other thing I'll mention to you, and feel free if you do not have these handouts to use to come up and pick them out as well. In addition to the case study, I've also provided you with a communication planning template, okay? There's 4 major areas here between audience, key messages, channels, and then product, which means product outputs. But you can use this as kind of a guide in answering these questions, okay? On the case study. And the last document we have, which is a take-along, this goes really good with Chardonnay, right? Okay, and this is a communication self-assessment. So this tells you how good you are, or I shouldn't say how good you are, what style of communication you tend to fall into. So if you fill these out, and I think it's self-explanatory. If you find it a little confusing, I can explain a little bit more. But if you fill out these questions, and they're in pairs, so if you fill out one here, if you fill out 2 here, and as you circle all these, they all come up to 40, but the higher numbers are going to kind of indicate what your particular style is. It's important to know who you are, okay, from a communication perspective, so you can make some adjustments, because you could be the problem. Okay? You could be the problem. So, but it's important to know that because you can fix it. You can fix it. Okay? The other thing to keep in mind is all of those map to these particular styles of orientation. So whether you're action-oriented, process-oriented, people-oriented, or ideas-oriented, it kind of tells you what the communication behavior is of that type of person. Okay? And then lastly, you got to know who your neighbor is, right? So you have to adjust to someone's communication style. So if they're really abrupt, whatever the case may be, you need to know how to communicate with them. This kind of outlines how they perceive things from a communication perspective. And then lastly, what I've done is overlaid that with just your orientations between what your particular value orientation is with you as a manager and or an employee, and how that interaction happens. Okay, so this is a nice little take home for you. Okay, so let's get started on the case study. Okay, is everybody clear?